This is a podcast about new crops. You're going to love it. Join us on The Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin.
I think you're understating how evil these birds are. They're
They're just hungry.
they're not even hungry. They can't possibly eat anymore, but they still peck all the berries off the plants. And they just get in a frenzy, dawn till dusk. They'll come down, they'll knock every berry off the plant.
Welcome to another episode of The Cutting Edge. My name is Stefan Mirsky. I'm coordinator for the Emerging Crops program at UW-Madison Extension. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about honeyberries. I'm joined today by my colleague, Ann Cohenstrott. Good morning, Ann. How are you doing?
Good morning, Stefan. I'm doing great. I am also with the Emerging Crops program with the UW-Madison Extension and excited to talk about the honeyberries here. We do have some trials going on, don't we, Stefan?
We sure do. We've got 4 trials now, I think. Yeah, 3 of them established last year. Madison, Spooner, and Bayfield, and then one in your area that went in the spring.
In Racine County, and some other ones perhaps on the horizon as well.
Cool. So we're expanding our honeyberry footprint throughout the state, which is exciting.
We are.
Well, today's guests, we've got 2 honeyberry growers. We've got George Terwey of Haskap, Minnesota, and Phil Stowe of Walking Plants Orchard. They're both in Minnesota, and they've both been growing honeyberries for quite a long time and have a lot of experience. So we're excited to have them on today's show. It's also a very, very timely episode because all 4 of us are actually on the planning committee for a big event coming up called the Upper Midwest Honeyberry Academy. And that's going to be on July 1st at George's farm in Stillwater, Minnesota. And it's going to be a field day. So there's going to be a tour of George's orchard, hopefully a harvest demo. We're also bringing in some expert speakers from Montana, as well as Bob Boers from University of Saskatchewan, and a bunch of other longtime growers from around the Upper Midwest. So it should be a really good day. I will put the link for registration in the show notes, so you can find that if you're interested.
No, that sounds great. How many people do you think we're going to have?
That's a good question. I don't know. It's the first real big honeyberry event that we've ever put on. So
I think people are pretty excited about it.
I think so. Yeah, I hope there's a good turnout.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, don't forget the product sampling that day. Yeah. Being able to actually taste the berries right out of the field is something that people being introduced to the fruit really enjoy.
That sounds great. It will be a good time for sure.
Yeah, super excited about that. Okay, so today's conversation is going to be very much production related. We're going to talk all about the A to Z of how to grow honeyberries from establishment to harvest, and hopefully get into some of the marketing aspects of it as well. So why don't we just jump right in, and we'll have George and Phil introduce themselves and just say a little bit about their farms. So, George, do you want to kick things off?
Sure. About, let's see, 30 years ago, I bought a hobby farm near Stillwater, probably because I grew up on a dairy farm. And, I researched some different things. I thought about growing grapes, thought about growing hops, and I finally settled on growing Haskap berries. And it's been an interesting journey. You'll hear about it as we go along on today's podcast.
Great, thanks, George. Phil, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Philip Stowe, and my business name is Walking Plants Orchard, and we grow honeyberries in west central Minnesota in eastern Douglas County. I've been growing them since 2011, and the ones that we grow are just primarily the ones that were released from the University of Saskatchewan's fruit breeding program. We grow 8 of the varieties that they've released, and every year we've been harvesting about 1,100 of those. And just recently, in the last year or so, we started selling at farmers markets, retail, and selling jam and topping and frozen berries. And prior to that, it was mostly wholesale sales to distillers, that sort of thing.
Nice. George, how many plants about do you have?
1,650. I'm actually licensed for a few more, 1,710, which is something people should note. I mean, I paid the licensing fee to the University of Saskatchewan. And oh yeah, I should have mentioned I'm Haskap, Minnesota. I planted 2 acres about 10 years ago. I'm a little different than Phil. I only planted 2 varieties, and I planted the 2 varieties that were easiest to harvest semi-mechanically. And that's just was based on time constraints and on the new varieties that had come along since Phil started to plant. So I have Boreal Beast and Boreal Beauty, and they're interspersed for pollination. And Phil is the person that got me interested in Haskap. But Phil, I can't remember how you were introduced to them.
Well, I'll give you a little bit of the story. I've also had the farm here for, well, since 2003, and then around 2010 I always wanted to like grow blueberries or something, like some sort of specialty crop, but then blueberries were not requires a soil that's more acidic than what we had here, and I certainly wasn't going to amend the soil for the plants that we had, or at least the scope that I wanted to grow. And so I knew blueberries were not the thing for me here. So I had some June berries that were growing pretty good. So I was thinking, hey, maybe I'll grow some June berries. So I called a June berry propagator in northern Michigan and told him I was just starting out. I wanted to grow, have some fruit farm here. And he told me, he said, if I was just starting out and I could grow any plant, I'd look into Haskap. This
The
was
Juneberry guy told you this?
yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's what he told me. This was in December 2010. And my response was, what's a Haskap? So that's what started my journey. And not too long after that, I tasted some at a fruit and garden show, and then I ordered some plants and put them in the ground. I didn't know anything about them, and the soil that we had was clay. That's where I put it into to begin with, and it didn't die, which was great. And um, so I had a lot to learn, and took a number of trips to Canada to learn about them. They have a educational day in the middle of the summer called Haskap Days, and I went up to took trips up there 3 or 4 times, and learned what I could, visit a few farms, and added different varieties as they were released from the fruit breeding program, and did an awful lot of trial and error. So anyway, so
Yeah.
it's been kind of a longer journey, and then I'd known George for quite a while. Also grew up on a dairy farm, and kind of got him involved with one of the trips I went up to Canada with, and he came back and ordered a bunch of plants.
Yeah, I just went to the one conference, and the timing was good for me, and what I wanted to do with part of my acreage here.
Mhm.
Anyway, I had my first berry right off the plant, right at Phil's farm, and
Nice.
really, I mean, there's something about that first one that you taste. It's unlike anything else. Kind of hard to describe.
Mhm.
So curious, where you each ordered your planting stock from, and what you thought of the the quality of it, and just to talk more generally about establishment. How did the first couple of years go for you?
So I was introduced to the berries at a fruit and garden show in St. Cloud, and I met Bernice from Honeyberry USA, and she gave me the first berries that I tasted, and I ordered from her. And then, as I had taken more trips to Canada, I had met other places to get berries from, and Bernice did a great job and everything, but it's just I ended up making connections and ordered a few plants from different propagators, and some of them are still there, some of them are not. So I've gotten my plants from a variety of different sources, and but Bernice does offer really good customer service, and she's very, very knowledgeable.
Yeah, I can
Mhm.
furnace as well. So my stock was propagated in a greenhouse in Canada, and then I ordered through Burness and delivered directly to the farm here.
And how did you, for the establishment phase, how did you prepare the ground? What did you lay down any weed barriers when you planted? Irrigation? What did that establishment phase look like? How did you lay out your orchard?
Well, mine was pretty simple. I plowed right in the sod where I wanted to plant, rototilled, amended my soil with horse manure, and then I put down I got a little bit of a setback because it was too wet to use my machine to put in my fabric mulch because that doesn't work when it's wet. The soil has to be a little bit on the dry side to cover very well. But anyway, once I got that in, then I just had a planting party with volunteers. My rows are 12 feet apart. My plants are 4 feet apart within the rows. Uh, 1/3 beast and 2/3 beauty. Because at that time I thought beauty is a little bit rounder berry and would harvest better. And that's true. Um, I might have gone 50-50 though, because the beast I think has a little bit better flavor. There is one thing that I did, and it's like, don't do what I did, do what Phil did. I put in 4 foot wide fabric, and I think a 6 foot wide fabric is better because by the time 8 inches on each side is tucked into the soil, and then the grass grows in 4 inches, you're left with a fabric barrier that's 2 feet wide.
It's
And it
true.
worked well. I mean, eventually these plants get big and they get thick and form a hedgerow, and they'll snuff out anything underneath the plants. And that's just the phase that I'm in right now, where weeding is getting easier.
Did you lay irrigation line down underneath that?
Yeah, with my machine, that it came with the machine. You put on a big spool of the
Mhm.
thin ribbon tape stuff, drip line,
Yep.
and that
Yep.
goes right under the fabric. And that was really nice when I planted because we'd plant a row, that row would be getting watered automatically underneath the fabric. We'd be planting the next row, and you just move over. I have 19 rows going across my 2 acres, and it worked well for that. Then the next year I had dry weather. I just hooked up the hose, worked beautifully. Then a couple years later, I tried to water, and by that time, when it's really dry and you're in a drought, all the little critters in the world are also looking for a sip of water, and they chewed holes in some of the lines. You try patching them, you know. So from now on, if I irrigate, I'll just lay down the same exact drip line. It's cheap, and just do it on top of the fabric and just water row by row. And I think, Phil, I've heard your advice on watering. It's important to do it as the berries are developing, not so much towards the end when you want the sugars to concentrate in the berries. And I think Phil and myself and other growers, we learned last year when it was too wet that it's really hard to harvest because the skins get stretched tight and really thin and they juice up a little bit more. The flavor's good. They're just harder to handle.
That's exactly true. Yeah, that's what I've experienced. If I was to put in another orchard, it would be to grow the varieties that are they come off the plants with mechanical harvesting tools where they don't bleed. But I like the rows that I've got. My rows are 13 feet on center, and then between the plants, I have 4.5 feet. And then every 100 foot, I have an opening so that you don't have to walk around the whole length of the row to go across rows. And the entire rows that I have been using are about 300 feet because like the netting that we buy I think it's 310 feet, which allows you to not do so much net splicing, which is nice. And irrigation, I have installed irrigation lines on one of the orchards, but I haven't really used them. Just monitor at this point. We monitor the amount of rain that we get in April, May, and first part of June. And if we're lacking, I'll just water based on that when the berries are developing, and then everything else seems to take care of itself.
Do either of you guys grow anything in between the rows, or how do you manage that space?
Well, I planted initially just a white Dutch clover, but what happens is that after a number of years go by, the grasses and natural growth kind of weed out the clover. But the first couple of years when the clover is growing, bees are just like jubilant. There's a lot of flowers there.
Bill, what did you do for weed management? Did you lay down fabric as well?
Yeah, well, first none, then wood chips, then 3-foot fabric, and then I found that the 6-foot fabric and an installer works good. So like I do deep tilling. I didn't actually plow, but I do deep tilling on the orchard, and then pretty much pick the rock and make it smooth as I can get, so that when the fabric comes, that installer comes, they'll it goes in nicely. And before I do all that stuff, I test the soil and do a one-time amendment, because after you put the plants in and you put the fabric in, you only get one shot at fixing the soil. So, and it doesn't produce any fruit for at least 3 years. So, it's just you just get one shot.
For the fabric, do you burn a hole where you're going to put the plant, or do you lay it on either side of the two strips on the other side?
Well, when the plants, so like I've got some plants I'm going to be putting in this actually this next month, and they're too big, so I'm going to actually have to make a hole in the fabric, and I think maybe burning a hole is what I'll do. But before I had smaller plants, so I would put the plants in first, and then they were small enough that as the fabric was installed, they would cut a little hole and pull the plant through. So it really depends on the size of your plants.
Well, let's talk about bird protection, because we know that's like one of the most important things that growers need to do.
Yeah, the first time that so what happens, and I didn't know this, is that I had never seen a cedar waxwing, not until I got berries. And what happens is that I don't know if they're flying north at that time when the fruit's starting to turn purple. But what happens is that they send out these scouts, and then they find some berries and they tell their friends, and before you know it, you have no berries. So, and that happened to us, and then we realized we needed to get netting. So,
I think you're understating how evil these birds are. They're
just hungry.
They're not even hungry. They can't possibly eat anymore, but they still peck all the berries off the plants. And they just get in a frenzy, dawn till dusk. They'll come down, they'll knock every berry off the plant, and they can't eat them all. But when it comes to bird deterrence, I mean, you can use air cannons, screech alarms, falcons, drones, but really you need netting,
Mhm.
I, I think, especially up here, if you have neighbors around, air cannons and screech alarms and stuff might not be very popular.
We have different netting systems though. I went with over the row netting, and we currently secure it with bags that they use for flood protection. They're little white bags and put sand in them, and that works okay.
Mhm. About what time of the growth stage do you put that netting on?
Well, as soon as they turn purple, the birds will arrive. So you got to make sure that you get them on while the berries are still green.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll start netting here um, June 2nd. And I have had problems getting the nets on. I mean, even if you're 3 days too late, they're going to reduce your yield. I have a little bit of a different situation. I planted my berries in a big rectangle up on a big flat field. So uh, that's easier to have overhead netting. And I'm happy with my choice of overhead netting. The big storm that came through the first year I put it up did some damage in Hudson, and uh, I had to make some repairs and reinforce some things. But since then, I haven't had any problems. And I'd say the advantage to overhead netting, it's more money probably when you first get started because you got to buy the poles, put up the wires. Takes a little bit more netting, maybe, probably not that much more by the time you wrap individual rows. When you net over the rows, there's certain problems you can have. Birds can try to push in through the netting to get to the berries. Uh, Once you put the nets over the rows, you're pretty much done mowing. So I can mow, right up to the point where I don't want to brush against the plants and knock any berries loose. And that's a little bit nicer for the way I harvest, is to, have the grass not growing up into the berries that are, down low. So yeah, I'm happy with my overhead netting. This year is the first year that I'll have to put up the side nets. I've always gotten by with just the overhead netting, and the birds would fly under there, and then they'd fly up and hit that net overhead, and it'd freak them out. And they either have smarter birds or they just adapted. But this year I'll put up the side nets and I'll solve that problem.
Phil, a question for you about your individual over the row netting. Are you suspending the netting above the plants, or are you just draping that netting right on top of them?
Well, the type of netting you get is important because the first nettings that we got was heavier, and I suspended the nets on like a wire or rope that goes over the rows, so it suspends it. So most of the weight is not on the plants. But what can happen is if your net is heavy and you're in and it's touching the plants and you're in a windy area, the wind will shake the plant and you'll get some berry drop because of the uh, just the pressure on the plants. So that's something to consider. The nets that we are using now are lighter weight and they do a good job. They cost a little bit more, but on the full grown plants that have a full canopy, the we just put them over the top, and they seem to have enough branches to hold everything up, and they're full enough not to really worry about the berry drop that you'll get with a smaller plant that doesn't have as much stability.
So the morning that you're going to harvest, you have to take off your over the row netting. You just do it as gently as possible. Yeah, even without netting, without wind, you'll still drop 10 to 15% of the berries before harvest. And it's just the way these plants are.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about how like heavy rain or even a light rain affects those berries. Does it knock them off pretty easily?
Um, when the nets are on, like on the over the row, a lot of times they actually, if you get a heavy rain, the nets will actually break it up a little bit.
We'll get into harvest methods in just a second, but before we do, what do you do for annual management? Do you do any pruning? What do you do for fertility? Do you have to manage weeds at all? Uh, insect disease control, any of that? What do you do on an annual basis?
George, go ahead.
Yeah, this is the first year that I pruned. So what happened is 2 years ago in April, we had an ice storm that just bent over the trees and bent over the plants, just smashed them right to the ground. And I waited a year. I thought they'd recover, but they didn't recover fully. So I did, hedging this year on the lower side of the plant. And so far, that looks like a good result. For one thing, on those lower branches, you can't get the harvest trays underneath anyway. And, like grapes, you want airflow and air movement. So I've hedged and pruned my plants to be more upright and get air movement underneath. But different varieties of Haskap grow different. Some will grow up with, with 1 or 3 stems. Some of them will grow up from the ground. They'll have a dozen stems. Fertility, I've done nothing so far other than my initial testing of the soil and amending. Weed management, we talked about mulch, but those early years you pull a lot of weeds, even with the mulch to keep them from getting established within the row.
I do similar things because I have more variety. Some of the growth patterns and mistakes that I made earlier where I put them too close together. My first rows were, I think, only 9 feet apart, and I planted them 3 feet in between the plants with no walking areas. And what happens, and some of those early varieties grow as wide as they do tall, and so it gets to the point where you can't even go down the row because they've just overgrown. So at that point, it's like, okay, something has to be done. So this year I took and pruned every other one on a couple of rows, one row for sure. And when I say I pruned it, I aggressively pruned it. I took a chainsaw and cut it off at about 7 or 8 inches, and just as an experiment. And I see all kinds of new green shoots coming up. So it looks like the roots and the ability for the plant to rejuvenate is pretty decent, at least on the one cultivars that I pruned aggressively like that. And I have held back on pruning more than I probably should have because the particular varieties go to a particular customer, and I just wanted to make sure I had fruit for available. Because once you prune it, you're not going to get fruit that year, and probably not the next year after that.
But we really didn't talk about how big these plants can get. I'm sure the Beast variety can get up to 6 feet wide and 6 feet tall, which is another thing, the growth. When you start getting berries, the next year your berries will double. The year after that, they'll double because these are growing up and out. I'll be well over 4,000 pounds this year if we have a normal weather. And my plants are about half grown. So 1,650 plants, they're capable of producing 5 pounds per plant. So I could end up with 8,000 pounds here in a few years.
Have you guys noticed any sort of insects or disease?
In our particular location here, we have not had any issues with insects. It's the maturity, the berries mature, they start maturing depending on the variety, last week of June, maybe second week of June, depending on where you're located. But then you're usually done before, not too far after 4th of July, at least where we're at. So a lot of the insects they're just not there yet. So
Right. I have spotted wing Drosophila, and it's in the raspberries, but my Haskaps are already harvested, so I haven't any problem. I have no downy mildew, don't have any other problems. I had scale insects that were probably introduced by Bob's Diseased Trees mulching service. My mistake, poor orchard hygiene. So I sprayed with a organic product called neem oil, and that took care of that problem.
One of the questions I get commonly is deer and bear, depending on when you're located. But I currently haven't seen a lot of pressure from the deer. We don't have any deer fencing around, but
Yeah, the deer I have they roam right through the field because they're curious, but they don't really damage the plants or knock off many berries.
Okay, so let's get into harvesting. How do you actually determine the ripeness of the berry? When to harvest? Because I know that can be a kind of a tricky thing to do with this crop. And then how do you actually harvest?
Go ahead, George.
Well, I mean, I have a hydrometer, but really you just walk down the row and you taste them. And after a while you can tell, when they're ready. The bricks content, it's hard to get high. You can't get as high as grapes, but you can get up to between 12, 13, maybe 14, depending upon the variety. So, my market is primarily wineries, and they'll add water and a simple syrup, just to depending upon if they want a semi-sweet or a drier Haskap wine.
I I go by taste also, but what I currently do is that I have a couple of guys that help me out regularly every year, and I have 8 varieties, so not everything's coming ripe at the same time. So what we do is we walk around and early in the mornings, and I have the guys taste them, and then they kind of do that, and they know what they taste like, and it's nice that they do that because then they can plan, like, okay, this is the next one we're going to do, and they'll look at the weather, and if it's raining, they'll know that they don't need to come that day, that sort of stuff. So it's all taste based, and after you have them for a while. But the bricks thing is a lot of people ask about that. What, do you have a bricks meter? Yeah, I do. And the sugar content is not that. I mean, if you sell it to somebody that ferments the berries, they're going to change the sugar content in it anyway. So it's not as important as some other crops where the sugar is important as a harvest factor, at least depending on the customers that you have.
And how do you guys harvest then? Do you harvest by hand, mechanically? Seems to be a couple of different ways you can do it.
Yeah, so we harvest the same way on all the different cultivars, but we started out with little kiddie pools, and when we didn't have too many, and we'd cut those in half and shove them under the bushes. And there's nice YouTube videos out there on. And then I use a reciprocating saw, but it's a center held one where the battery is on the back, and the blade that I've created is on the front, so it's kind of balanced, and you can move it around, and that hits the plants, and it shakes the berries off into these catch pans that are on a waxwing harvester. It's a aluminum thing that goes around there's one pan on each side of the bush, and then there's an overhead thing that connects them together, and it you can go down the row with that, and then once the berries go into the harvest catch pans, they're tilted up and put into harvest trays, and we use the deep harvest totes that the winery will use, and then we use air to blow the debris and leaves around, and then depending on the variety, some of them, if it's what I'll call a wine variety or a juice variety, then they get cleaned and frozen. But if it's a variety that's clean enough for eating, we'll do more cleaning on those before they're frozen.
My method is a little different than Phil's. I build a harvest wagon that actually goes down the row, and people walk alongside the wagon. You shake them, they come off. I have a generator on the wagon, so we have power. It's a loud process. Shake them into the trays through a berry cleaner that has a screen, vacuums leaves off the top, the fines drop out the bottom. But I planted the two varieties that work best with semi-mechanical harvesting. So all mine come out food quality. There's no distinction for me. They go into jam or wine, whatever. You could talk just a little bit about when you make wine, the yield per pound is higher with Haskap than it is with grapes because the flavors are so concentrated. There's no stems, there's no seeds in a Haskap berry that you can detect. When you eat a berry, it's all berry. Harvest, Phil and I are a little bit different because Phil has a lot of different varieties. Phil, you must harvest for 4 weeks. I
Oh
mean,
yeah. We like this year. I'm targeting like starting June 23rd on the early varieties, and the late varieties we hope to be done by July 10 or July 11. We go for in the morning after the dew's done. We go until we basically have all of our harvest totes full, and then we'll process those and hopefully not everything's ripe at the same time.
right. So I kind of take a different approach. Even last year, I got all of my harvesting done in 5 days. They weren't all quite consecutive. I think there was a day off in there. Volunteer crews of 5 or 6, sometimes 7. We go down the row. Since my market is wineries, they actually want them mashed up and frozen. So you can get 40 pounds in a bucket if you mash them up. I have a stainless steel industrial grade thing that you just put on a big drill. From there, they go directly into the freezer. I am transitioning a little bit to more whole frozen berries because I'm getting more requests for that. But that's more work, of course. You have to put them on trays in a single layer, put them in the freezer, get the berries individually frozen solid. Then you have to scrape them off the pans while you're inside the freezer so no moisture collects on them to stick and freeze. And then you have to repackage them into smaller baggies after harvest when you have time to label them. People that make ice cream, uh, juices, smoothies, whatever, they want the whole frozen berries. So we charge more for the whole frozen berries. I should say that when I'm up in the field harvesting, the final inspection is by hand, but the cleaners now, Phil and I have worked hard to make them pretty efficient. And if the conditions are right, there's very little left that you have to pick out as far as green berries or anything else that stems or twigs.
Are you guys harvesting each row just once, or do you make several passes throughout the harvest season?
One time.
Just once.
One time.
Okay. Where do you
Yeah.
guys see growth in the markets?
For Canada, there's a lot of pick your own, and I think that's one growth market. And the reason is because it extends your pick your own market. Depending upon the variety, they can be ready probably a week before strawberries. And then you can plant the different varieties. You can probably get up to 6 weeks, or at least 5 weeks of Haskap harvest. So I know pick your own is big. And of course, Farm Lola, they are all pick your own, their market. They started out with blueberries and they already had clientele. And now the word has gotten out and they have a very loyal pick your own. I hopefully will branch out to pick your own. So my markets have all been wineries up till now. Now it's going to be more whole frozen and more pick your own. And I know Phil has commented that people that come in and do pick your own, once the season's over, they still want berries. And that's when you can sell the whole frozen berries. Anything you can make with a frozen blueberry, you can make with a frozen Haskap berry.
I'm curious what kind of prices you guys are getting for your frozen berries.
Well, usually a winery will ask for 800 pounds. I've sold 1,200 pounds at one shot to a winery before, so you reduce the price a little bit by the volume, but still $5 a pound. And there's 40 pounds in a bucket. So for the whole frozen, I hope to sell those for $7 a pound. According to Farm Lolo, I think $7 to $8 for pick your own.
We the wholesale to distillers, like what George was talking about. Currently, that's roughly the price range that I have, and the frozen vacuum pack, like at the farmers market, we sell those at retail at like $10 a pound.
So neither of you are selling fresh berries.
No, I mean we bring a few to the farmers market in the during harvest season, but we're so busy removing all these berries and getting them frozen that you just don't have time to be selling fresh berries, and the shelf life is short.
Yeah, very
Um,
short shelf life. So not like blueberries or even raspberries. If you want fresh berries, I think U-Pick is your only good option.
Yep.
Well, we hope that
Nice.
markets continue to grow.
That's where the academy comes in. And I work with Minnesota Growing, so my farm's listed with them. We're just trying to get the word out. Like I said, we're the pioneers. We're doing a favor for the next generation of growers.
For sure.
Well, I think this is probably a good place to leave it. But just want to thank Phil and George so much for joining us. And yeah, for those of you who are interested in attending the field day on July 1st, just look for the registration link in the show notes. We're hoping to get a large crowd of people to raise awareness about this new promising berry crop.
Yep. Thanks, guys. Always learn a lot when we chat. Always.
That's an
We
idea.
appreciate you.
Yep, glad to be here.
Yeah, glad to share.
Brought to you by the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension.